Welcome to my channel, The Binge Eating Therapist. I'm Sarah, former binge eater turned psychotherapist. And I cannot believe that I haven't done a video on this subject yet because it's a question that I get asked a lot. If you're somebody who has particular foods that you are more likely to binge on, foods that you feel out of control around, it seems to make logical sense to keep those foods out of the house. You've probably even heard that advice before from people. You tell people you're struggling with food and they'll say, have you tried not buying the food? Have you tried not having the food in the house? Has that really fixed your problem? If you're watching my videos, it probably hasn't, but it is about trying to make yourself feel safe, and I understand that, believe me. And yet by avoiding having these foods around, we kind of perpetuate this idea, this experience that we can't trust ourselves around these foods. In the intuitive eating world, the advice is to have these foods readily available for whenever you want them. The thinking is that we can habituate these foods and we can reduce the emotional charge around them so that they become more regular, and this in turn reduces our desire for them. So some people dive all in with this and they fill up their homes with these foods and they're like, oh my goodness, having these foods around is amazing. I feel like I can just, because I know it's always available, I don't feel compulsive around it anymore. And that's the very idealistic outcome that some people do have. And for the rest of us, it's a little bit messier. So this is not going to be a video where I say to you, simply just get all your foods that you normally struggle with and have them around you all the time. I take a bit of a more nuanced approach. So a couple of the advantages of having the foods around are, it reduces Last Supper eating. Because if you're always telling yourself you're going to be good tomorrow, you're going to be good tomorrow, and today's the write-off, today's the day you eat all the food, it's like you have to eat all the food to get it out of the house so that you have a clean slate tomorrow. And the very thinking mindset of that means that you will eat more food than you would have if you were allowed to have the food in the house and you're allowed to have it around every day. So that's one potential advantage. We know that binges can be triggered by restriction, scarcity, or even perception of scarcity. So having the foods around is to remind yourself that these foods are abundant, to remind yourself that these foods are not bad, you're allowed to have them, and that in turn is supposed to reduce the conflict you have around these foods. And when we're not in conflict with ourselves about these foods, sometimes it then becomes easier to make decisions and feel more regulated. And finally, by not allowing these foods in the house, you create more scarcity so that when you walk past a shop or you're doing your groceries, you can find yourself paralyzed with making a food decision because you have a desire for these foods that you know you don't have at home. And it feels like a now or never moment to have them because they're not readily available. And that can lead to more compulsive buying of foods and more binging. So these are some of the reasons why having these foods around at home can be helpful. Now for me, I've definitely done that where I have filled my cupboards with more what I would have called binge foods than I could eat. And it did help until I had a bad day. And then when I had a bad day, I would find myself drifting in and out of the kitchen, in and out of the kitchen. So it felt like doing it that way worked until it didn't. Because the thing is, I can be impulsive around food. And that doesn't have to be anything to do with restriction or lack of availability. There are foods that are designed just to be delicious and manufactured in a way to make us want to eat more. And that's not a pathological thing. But neither does it mean that if you're feeling like you're eating too many of these foods, that it's always because of restriction. So for a while in my recovery, I did something which I have stolen a phrase from the police. I was a police officer for 16 years. And when we had our officer safety training, there was something called a reactionary gap, which is where you leave I can't even remember what the distance was, 1.5 meters, I want to say, gap between you and the suspect or whoever the person is that you're talking to. And the idea of a reactionary gap is you are giving yourself a bit of space to react. And so it's the same thing with food. So I have lived in London for many years. I'm not at the moment, but that's where I've spent most of my adult life. And so I've always been close to grocery stores. And so I would, for a long time, not have the foods in the house. But I was a 2-minute walk from the store, and I would say to myself and really mean it, you can go and get these foods whenever you want to. But the fact that I had to make a decision to go and get the foods just gave me that little bit of reactionary time to check in with myself. Now, I didn't always. Sometimes a compulsive urge would hit me and I would just go and buy a load of binge foods. But I was practicing this more and more. It was a way of me gently giving myself permission that wasn't about having the food just 10 feet away in the next room. Now, I appreciate that not everybody lives that close to somewhere where you can get the food, but giving yourself that permission to go to acquire the foods when you want them. Again, the idea behind that is to reduce the conflict so that you can stay calm and make clearer decisions. And I still do it, it's slightly different now, my reactionary gap. But before I did this video, I was thinking, okay, what foods have I got in my house that are, the intuitive eating world sometimes calls them fun foods. So the kind of foods that we eat just because they're delicious to eat. And now I'm going away tomorrow for a fortnight, so I probably have less in the house than I normally would. But I have Lotus biscuits, and I hadn't really thought about this in a while, but when I buy them in it's like a long packet, but then they're in little packs of 2. Now, this is not to say that when I have a biscuit, I'm only allowed 2 biscuits. And when they're gone, if I want more, it's a much clearer decision than when I'm just taking them out of the packet. Now, I'm not saying that, because I realise how this can sound, it can almost sound like a diet tip. Just buy things in single portions and then you'll only eat them in single portions. That's not what I'm saying. But I found that when I bought things that I have to unwrap, that it just gave me that extra second to check in with myself. Now, the checking in with yourself is only going to work if you can regulate yourself. So if you're feeling very stressed around food, you're not going to care about checking in. And I've definitely had those moments as well. And I want to normalize that. So in order to regulate, that is about your self-talk, which is reminding you that there's no correct number of biscuits or cookies for some of our international friends. There's no correct amount to eat. There's no right or wrong decision. You may make a decision, feel like it was too much, and experience some regret. That's okay. Food regret can be just a healthy part of a normal relationship with food. And the other thing I currently have in the house is, my UK people will be very familiar with this, celebrations. And yes, there's only the rubbish ones left. And again, these are chocolates and they're all individually wrapped. But don't get me wrong, in my binging days, I have smashed a whole tub of these. And the fact they were wrapped didn't make a difference. So the whole point of having these foods around is to prevent the triggering of that feeling of scarcity, that feeling of I can't have, which can lead to rebellious eating as well. So this is about finding a balance. So it might not be that you just get in loads of different types of foods that you feel uncomfortable with. You might just start bringing in a few at a time. I had a time when I remember buying 36 club bars. If you're in the UK, you'll know what club bars are. They're just these little chocolate bars about this big, again individually wrapped. And I had 36 of them in the house because I wanted that feeling of abundance. And it was easier for me to feel regulated if I had an abundance of one thing at that time, compared to if I'd had a variety. So it's like how to bring more of these foods around you in a way where you feel safer. And you are not failing if there are some foods that even years down the line you don't feel comfortable having in the house. I think it can sound like, oh, well, you haven't made peace with that food if you can't have it in the house. And so for me, the food that I don't have in the house, that I really, really like, is Nutella. And I don't think that comes from a restrictive place because I judge Nutella or I think it's a bad food. I think it's an amazing food. But I also know that when I have it in the house, it calls to me. And that it's likely that I may end up eating more of it, maybe quite a bit more than I feel comfortable with. Simply because it's so delicious and you can put it on anything. So could I regulate around Nutella? I think I could. I think I could have a jar in the house and I don't think it would stress me out. But I think it would take energy because I think I would be checking in with myself a lot. So having foods in the house is not like a binary all or nothing thing. I think the goal of anybody who struggles with binge eating is to learn how to find the middle ground. And this is just another concept that you can practice trying to find some kind of middle ground with. Don't get me wrong, if you want to go all in with this, do it. It works brilliantly for some people. But if doing it all at once doesn't work for you, you're not failing at this. Many of us don't find it that straightforward as just have the foods around you and you will get used to them. This is more complicated than that. I also think that if you're going to bring in foods that have a lot of emotional charge, foods that you often feel out of control around, is to have some intentions around how you want to approach these foods. I don't mean intentions about how much you want to eat, but about how you want to approach it. So it could be you get some of your favourite sweet foods in and you just set yourself an intention that when I eat these, I'm going to make sure that I'm feeling calm. I'm going to make sure that I really enjoy them and that I taste them and that I appreciate them. These kind of things will help with that feeling of regulation, which will then help to regulate your behaviours around these foods. And intentions will help with the self-talk because you use that to reassure yourself. So one of the ways that I spoke to myself a lot during recovery was, it doesn't matter how much I eat. What matters to me is that it's not compulsive. And I knew that the two ways that something would become compulsive is, one, if I got in a battle with myself about it, because when I'm in conflict, I just want to, let me just eat all the food to get rid of the conflict. Or two, if I wanted to just numb out. Or three, if I wasn't eating enough and there was some restricted thinking going on. But it's like understanding what fires up those compulsive urges and what is it you need to be thinking and feeling in order to bring those down, at least to a manageable level. Now, Steph and I have recorded a whole podcast episode about keeping foods in the house where we go into this in more depth and look at it from a few other angles. So that will be coming out next week, and it's episode 123 of the Life After Diets podcast. You might want to check that out. Anyway, let me know your experiences. What has worked and not worked for you when it comes to bringing foods into the house and trying to habituate these challenging foods? Let me know in the comments below. But thank you for watching, and I will see you on the next video.